Picture this: a courtroom in Berlin, March 2nd, 1938. A man in prison clothes stands before the judge. For the past 7 months, he has been held at Moabit prison awaiting trial. His wife Elsa permitted to visit, his lawyers permitted to attend. The legal form still carefully observed. Now the verdict is read. Not guilty of the most serious charges. 9 months already served in pretrial detention. The judge considers the matter closed. The gallery exhales. His wife Elsa, sitting behind the dock, allows herself to breathe for the first time in months. The lawyers begin gathering their papers. He does not go home. The following morning, instead of walking through the front door of his house in the leafy suburb of Dahlem, he is put in a car and driven east, to Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Not because of any court order, because through Himmler's administrative apparatus, he has been classified a Sonderhäftling, a special prisoner, and the Führer is determined to silence him. The camp commander reads the prisoner's new official designation: Hitler's personal prisoner. Solitary confinement, a single cell, a Bible, and the slow, crushing realization that the most powerful government in Europe considers one Lutheran pastor's voice dangerous enough to bury alive. What few people know is that this man had voted for the Nazis, had cheered their rise to power, had called Hitler an instrument God might use. And when the first arrests began, when they came for the communists, the trade unionists, the Jews, he had stayed quiet. He told himself it was not his problem. His name is Martin Niemoller, and from that cell came the words that no government on earth has been able to silence. Comment below with "I will not be silent" if you are ready to refuse the comfortable silence of uninvolvement. Preach when the authorities are watching, and stand for those being taken before they come for you. Stay to the end, where the 3 disciplines that kept Martin burning through 8 years in a Nazi prison will enable you to run with endurance the race God has set before you. He was born on January 14th, 1892, in Lippstadt, Germany, the second of 5 children born to Heinrich Niemöller, a Lutheran pastor. Before he was 4 years old, he saw a picture of Jesus of Nazareth in a wordless picture Bible in the family home. He could not explain what happened when he looked at it, but something about that face settled into him like a stone dropped into still water. He would carry it for 90 years. He would later say that picture represented the actual content of what occupies me as a Christian and has borne and bears my life. Long before he understood theology, he had seen the face of the one he would spend his whole life following, and failing, and following again. At 18, he joined the Imperial German Navy. By the time the First World War ended, he was a submarine commander who had earned the Iron Cross First Class, having sunk Allied shipping in the waters around Marseille. The war formed him in ways that took decades to unravel. His naval cohort of 1910 included a man named Karl Dönitz, who would one day command Hitler's entire navy and briefly become Germany's head of state in the final days of the Reich. 2 men from the same class, the same formation, the same Germany, the same uniform. One would be the Führer's chosen successor. The other would be his most famous prisoner. In 1910, they were simply cadets. When Germany surrendered in 1918, Niemöller was outraged. He believed the country had been betrayed from within, stabbed in the back, not defeated on the battlefield. He tried farming after the war, intending to buy land with his savings. Inflation wiped those savings out before he could close a deal. He worked as a farmhand for a season, watching Germany come apart. Then, in September 1919, he settled his future with a question in his diary: "Will I become a theologian?" His father replied, "Son, if you are worried about freedom of conviction, the Protestant pastor is the freest profession in the world." Those words hit him, he would later say, like a bolt of lightning. The same phrase he would reach for again, decades later, for the most important moment of his imprisonment. He enrolled in theology at Münster. But from 1919 to 1922, he was more activist than academic, a member of no fewer than 8 radical nationalist and Völkisch organizations, all of which championed racial anti-Semitism in some form. He served in the Freikorps, the paramilitary groups who fought communists in the streets of Weimar Germany. He was not merely someone who had looked away. In those years, he had actively chosen a side. He was ordained in 1924. That same year, he married Elsa Bremer. They would have 7 children together. He spent 7 years in social welfare work with the Inner Mission of Westphalia before being called in 1931 to the Dahlem parish in Berlin, an affluent, influential congregation of politicians, military officers, and business leaders. He was exactly where he had always wanted to be. He had the ear of the powerful. He had a congregation worth having. And then the Nazis rose to power. And for a brief, consequential moment, Martin Niemoller thought this was the answer to everything he had been praying for. He voted for the Nazi Party. He gave a sermon on the morning of the March 5, 1933 election, the first and last free election in Nazi Germany, encouraging his congregation to take a conscientious stand this very day. He celebrated Hitler's rise. He spoke of the Führer as a possible instrument of God to restore a Christian Germany. He was not an outlier. Most of the German Protestant Church felt precisely the same way. The cost of this silence was already compounding. It would take years to appear on the ledger, but it was there. The collision came faster than Niemöller expected. Within months of taking power, the Nazis began to Nazify the German Protestant Church, creating the German Christians movement, which pushed what they called the Aryan paragraph: Jewish-born Christians to be removed from ordained ministry, the Old Testament to be stripped from German Bibles. Their slogan stated their theology with brutal honesty. Baptism can't straighten out a hooked nose. Niemöller was appalled, not primarily because of the Jews, whose suffering was not yet his primary moral concern. He was appalled because the state was reaching its hand into the church and rearranging it to suit the Reich. That was the line. He founded the Pastors' Emergency League in September 1933 to resist the intrusion. Within months, 6,000 pastors had signed on, the largest organized act of Protestant church resistance to Nazism in Germany. Standing beside him at the Dahlem pulpit was his younger assistant, Franz Hildebrandt, a pastor of Jewish descent. The man with anti-Semitic convictions had a Jewish co-worker. This is the kind of contradiction that history gives you when a conscience is still only halfway awake. On January 25, 1934, Niemöller was summoned with other church leaders to the Reich Chancellery. Hitler was waiting. Before Niemöller could speak, Hitler produced a Gestapo transcript of his private phone conversations, tapped, typed out, placed on the table as evidence of disloyalty to the state. Others in the room fell silent. Niemöller did not. He replied directly to the Führer, "We too have a responsibility given to us by God, and from that no man can absolve us." It was the first time he had spoken directly to power and refused to flinch. Hitler did not forget. That May, Niemöller joined Karl Barth and 320 other pastors at the Barmen Synod. Together they wrote the Barmen Declaration, a theological document asserting, simply and at enormous cost, Jesus Christ alone is Lord of the Church, not the Führer, not the Reich, not the German race, not the nation. The declaration was smuggled out of Germany and published in the London Times. More than a third of German Protestant clergy signed in support. The Confessing Church was born, and Niemöller was now on every Gestapo list in the country. Gestapo agents sat in the pews every Sunday, transcribing his sermons word by word. His phone was tapped. His mail was read. He preached anyway. We have no more thought of using our own powers to escape the arm of the authorities than had the apostles of old. No more are we ready to keep silent at man's behest when God commands us to speak. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 14 years younger, had not been fooled for a single day. He had seen Hitler clearly from the first hour of power. He would later describe Niemöller and those like him in 1933 as naive, starry-eyed idealists who thought that they were the real National Socialists. But he watched Niemöller closely, and what he saw slowly was a man beginning to wake up. On June 27, 1937, Niemöller stepped into the Dahlem pulpit for the last time. The church was packed. Word had spread that something was coming. He preached from Acts 5:29. We must obey God rather than men. 4 days later, July 1st, 1937, the Gestapo knocked. The regime has every sermon, every phone transcript, every letter. They have classified him a special prisoner. The question is not whether he will be arrested. The question is, what happens to a man's faith when the most powerful government in Europe decides his voice must be buried? The answer is a cell. And in that cell, something the Führer did not plan for. Before we follow Martin into Sachsenhausen, a quick word. This story took weeks of research to uncover. Work our members make possible. If you would love to be part of the community that ensures these hidden legacies are told and told well, hit the join button on the channel homepage. You will not just be a member of this channel, you will be standing in the same spirit as the witnesses themselves and encouraging many others to run with endurance the race God has set before them. He arrived at Sachsenhausen in the spring of 1938 as Hitler's personal prisoner, Sonderhäftling in the official paperwork. Special prisoner, solitary confinement. No congregation, no pulpit, no visitors beyond what the pre-trial period had permitted. Now not even that. His Bible was his lifeline. He read it every day, marked it, annotated it, wrote from it. He produced a handwritten theological manuscript entirely from memory, filling page after page in his cell. He prayed, not only for his family, not only for the confessing church, not only for the men and women he had known before the arrest. He prayed for the guards. "Do you know anyone who needs your prayers more than your enemies?" he asked another prisoner who challenged him on that. In 1939, with the war beginning, Niemöller petitioned the government to release him so he could serve in the German Navy. He wanted to fight for the same state that had imprisoned him without charge. The petition was denied. Of course it was. The regime could not exactly process a job application from its most famous political prisoner. But the petition tells you something essential. The man who had stood against the Nazi intrusion into the church was still willing to fight in the Nazi war. His transformation was real, and it was still unfinished. God was not done with him yet. While he sat in his cell, the world was responding in ways he could not see. In December 1940, Time magazine put him on its cover with the headline, "In Germany, only the cross has not bowed to the swastika." Between 1937 and 1945, the New York Times would mention him more than 160 times. The Chicago Rabbinical Association distributed prayers for his welfare to its members. Jewish communities across America were praying for the release of a man who, in 1933, had written in favor of Germany's right to defend itself from Jewish influence. He did not know any of this. He was in a cell. Through all of it, his wife Elsa did not stop. She raised their 7 children alone, maintained contact with international church networks, lobbied wherever she could, kept his name before the press. Her sustained effort helped maintain the public pressure on the regime across all 8 years of his captivity. She was not a footnote to his story. She was a partner in it. In 1941, he was transferred to Dachau, where he was held in the Führer block, the clergy barracks housing more than 2,500 priests and pastors from across occupied Europe. Catholics, Protestants, clergy from Poland, France, the Netherlands, Luxembourg. Men from every tradition who had each refused some demand of the state and paid the price. The nationalist who had spent his adult life measuring authentic Christianity through the lens of German Protestant identity now knelt and prayed alongside Catholic priests, broke bread with them, listened to them. The walls he had built over decades, theological, national, cultural, dissolved one by one in the darkness. The ecumenism that would define the second half of his life was born not in a conference room, but in a Nazi concentration camp. Then, in the summer of 1944, nearly 7 years into his imprisonment, an SS guard finished bringing his food ration and turned to leave the cell. Niemöller watched him go, and something came. He would later describe it as a bolt of lightning, the same words his father had spoken about the pulpit decades earlier. Only this lightning struck a different truth. He could not say this man had nothing to do with him. As a Christian, he could not draw a circle around the people Christ had died for and leave anyone outside of it. Not this guard, not, as he would put it, even Joseph Stalin. "I cannot believe as a Christian that Jesus died for me, specifically for me. If I say but for him, even if it is Joseph Stalin, he did not die." That gives a completely different, grounding, upsetting attitude. He had never spoken to any of the men in black uniforms who brought his food, not once in all those years. Now he could not pretend they were not there. That same year, the Nazis finally permitted a small religious service for a handful of Protestant inmates. On Christmas Eve 1944, in Dachau concentration camp, Martin Niemoller preached, "No man is so forsaken and homeless in this world that God does not seek him in the midst of our human distress." It was Christmas. It was a death camp, and the gospel was still true. In April 1945, as the Reich collapsed, Hitler ordered the execution of high-profile prisoners. Niemöller was placed on a death transport. Cattle cars moving through the Alps, execution possible at any moment. American forces intercepted the convoy in the Tyrol in early May 1945. Martin Niemoller stepped off the transport a free man after nearly 8 years. Else was waiting. In November 1945, they returned together to Dachau. They walked to the crematorium. On the wall was a plaque that read, "Here, in the years 1933 to 1945, 238,756 people were cremated." He stood in silence, reading the dates. Dachau had opened in 1933, 4 full years before his arrest. He had an alibi for 1937 to 1945. God was not asking about those years. He told a German audience shortly after, "My alibi accounted for the years 1937 to 1945, but God was not asking me where I had been from 1937 to 1945, but from 1933 to 1945. And for those earlier years, I did not have any answer." In October 1945, Niemöller helped draft the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, the German Protestant Church on its knees before the world. We accuse ourselves for not witnessing more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently. By our passivity, endless suffering was experienced by many people and countries. One of the most remarkable acts of corporate repentance in the history of the institutional church. He did not ask the world to forgive Germany. He led the church to confess first. For 12 months, November 1945 to November 1946. He crisscrossed bombed-out Germany preaching guilt and repentance. In ruined church buildings, standing in rubble, speaking to congregations who had lost everything, he improvised a confession. It was never written. It was never the same twice. It grew from his own pain, spoken differently in every building to every audience. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. It was not a poem. It was a compulsion, and it never stopped spreading. First, it reached American audiences during the McCarthy era, a warning about the price of silence in a new season of political fear. Then, the civil rights movement. Elie Wiesel cited it. Martin Luther King Jr. cited it. It was placed on the wall of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, on the Boston Holocaust Memorial, across Europe, into languages Niemöller never spoke and countries he would never visit. He spent the rest of his life speaking, president of the Church of Hesse-Nassau, president of the World Council of Churches, an early visitor to Moscow in 1952, seeking reconciliation while the Cold War was still hardening. In 1954, a conversation with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Otto Hahn changed him again. Hahn told him it was now scientifically possible to build a device that could extinguish all life on the Earth's surface. Niemöller had a few sleepless nights. Then he picked up his New Testament and reread it from beginning to end, asking one question: how does the message of salvation relate to the use of violence? He became a pacifist. Many who had admired his courage against Hitler were furious. He did not slow down. Near the end of his life, he said, "I started my political career as an ultra-conservative who wanted the Kaiser to come back, and now I am a revolutionary. If I live to be 100, I shall maybe be an anarchist." Martin Niemoller died in 1984. He was 92 years old. He had never stopped speaking. You stayed to the end. Here is what kept Martin Niemoller burning through 8 years in a Nazi prison and 4 decades of witness beyond it. 3 disciplines. The first is Scripture. Every day in the cell, Sachsenhausen, Dachau, the Bible. He read it, marked it, annotated it, and produced a handwritten theological manuscript entirely from memory, filling page after page when no library was available and no congregation was waiting for the work. This is what the Word does when it has been genuinely embedded in a person. It becomes productive even in the dark. When the pulpit is taken and the congregation is gone and the Gestapo has every sermon on file, the Word remains, not only as comfort, as material, something to think with, something to produce from, something that cannot be confiscated. 8 years in Sachsenhausen and Dachau could not stop a man who had spent years putting the Word inside himself. When everything else was stripped away, that was all he needed. The second is prayer, including deliberate, sustained, costly prayer for the men who locked the door. Do you know anyone who needs your prayers more than your enemies? This is not a sentiment. It is a practice and a demanding one. Every day in that cell he prayed for the guards, for the regime, for the officials who had processed his imprisonment and signed their names to it. He did not do this because they deserved it. He did it because he could not, as a Christian, draw a circle around the people Christ had died for and leave anyone outside of it. Not a guard, not Joseph Stalin, not, as he had to admit, even the men who had classified him Sonderhäftling and driven him to the camp. Prayer kept pointing him back toward the people he most wanted to exclude, until one afternoon in 1944, a guard walked out of his cell and God broke through like lightning. Years of prayer for an unseen man had prepared the moment when Niemöller could no longer pretend the man wasn't there. The third is repentance. Not once, not as a crisis response, but as a lifelong practice, renewed and deepened every year for the rest of his life. He did not manage his failure from 1933 to 1937. He did not rationalize it or explain it away, or note that many other reasonable people had made the same mistake. He named it. He named it in front of German congregations who were still clearing rubble from their bombed streets, who had every reason to want the story of the German church to be better than it was. He named it in ruined church buildings, to audiences who had lost everything, in words that were never exactly the same twice. The confession was not a poem someone wrote. It was what came out of a man who never stopped repenting, and it became the most quoted statement about silence and complicity in the modern world, still spreading into languages he never spoke and countries he never visited, precisely because it was not an argument. It was a confession. It had the weight of genuine guilt behind it. These 3 disciplines did not get him out of the cell. They made him the man the Führer could not kill, could not silence, and, in the end, could not outlast. The Third Reich lasted 12 years. Niemöller's words are still echoing. Before you close this video, one question: are you justifying a silence you will one day confess? Are there people around you being taken whose suffering you have decided is not your concern? The cost of that silence is documented in 238,756 names on a Dachau wall. Niemöller carried the weight of those 4 silent years, 1933 to 1937, into every bombed-out church, every confession he gave, for the rest of his life. He never stopped. Comment below with "I will not be silent" if you are done with justified quiet. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next witness in this series. This week, name one group of people being marginalized whose cause you have been avoiding. Spend 5 full minutes reading about them. Pray one deliberate, specific prayer on their behalf. Then ask God whether He is calling you to speak, before the silence becomes a confession you cannot take back. Our next witness never waited for imprisonment to act. While Niemöller sat in his cell, a Dutch watchmaker's daughter was hiding Jewish families behind a bookshelf in her father's clock shop. When the Gestapo finds the room and arrests her entire family, when her sister dies in her arms inside the worst women's camp in the Nazi system, what discipline walks her out the other side, choosing forgiveness over bitterness? Next, Corrie ten Boom.